Hello, everyone. This is fantastic. Thank you for joining us. Let's get going. So, as I said, my name is Robin, and I'm a campaigner with the Council of Canadians. I work primarily on climate justice issues, and I live and work in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, which is on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. I found my way here. I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Ontario. I found my way here from the territories of the Wendat, Mississauga, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee nations in southern Ontario. And my family arrived there from Scotland and from Ireland many, many decades before that. And personally, my grandfather and great-grandfather on opposite sides of my family both fought in different world wars, experiencing both the horrors of war and also the supports that were available to veterans afterwards. And my family has experienced, as a result of those supports that were given to them, generations of economic benefits due to the support that my white grandfathers were given after they returned from war. And this has contributed to generations of privilege in my family, which I've experienced. And while some supports, some of those types of supports were made available to veterans of color after the war, they weren't the same, they weren't as robust, and didn't result in the same multi-generational benefits that my family has experienced. And of course, many of us probably know one of the primary resources given to veterans after the war was land. And that land was taken out from under the careful stewardship of Indigenous nations. And I share this very brief history of my own, as kind of my own personal land acknowledgement, understanding that decisions were made and structures were created over centuries that brought me to where I am in this conversation tonight, that unfairly benefited me at the cost of dispossessing so many and brought our society into a state of deep inequality that we're in now. And this brief story reminds me that the decisions that resulted in this structural inequality were made by people, and that people like all 363 of us on this call, we all have the power to make different decisions and different structures that are equitable and fair and can support life. And I mention all of this and give this brief context because of the topic of tonight's webinar, which the focus of which is the ideas from Seth Klein's new book called A Good War, which examines the way that Canada's government mobilized resources to fight in World War II and how we can draw lessons from that experience. Both things we can do again as we combat the climate crisis, and things we should not do, like cement inequality even further. Of course, this book, Seth will say, is not an attempt to glorify war by any means, but it is an attempt to understand the scale of change and the mobilization of resources that can be made when those in power put their minds to it. Of course, we have a much more recent example of real swift transformation than World War II, and that's the response to the pandemic that we're still experiencing. In the last year, we've seen governments create income supports, whole industries have moved to working from home, and there's been transformations in the way we prioritize supporting communities that are marginalized by business as usual, and much more than that. These experiences can give us insights into how we mobilize resources and support, and how we mobilize supports to further transform our society in response to the climate crisis, which of course is linked to the grave structural inequalities in power that I was mentioning before and that I'm sure we all have some familiarity with. So tonight, here in this conversation, we're going to hear from Seth Klein, and he'll focus on a few ideas that came out in his recent book. One is around political polarization. In the beginning of World War II, society was very polarized about whether or not Canada should even participate in the war, and the governments responded to this polarization to build the buy-in they needed to participate in the war. And this is kind of similar to today, where we face a huge amount of polarization about how we could or should respond to the climate crisis. And so I hope Seth will give us some insights about what we can learn from our past to combat the polarization that we're experiencing now. And another theme of this evening is that social movements have a huge role to play in creating the political will for governments to take swift and transformative action to address the climate crisis. And so another theme of this evening's discussion will be mobilization and building social movements that are powerful enough to push governments towards transformative climate action. So on that, we'll also hear from two organizers from different initiatives in Canada that are proposing and organizing for bold and transformative changes. we have Hannah Gelderman from Climate Justice Edmonton, and she'll tell us about that group's work in mobilizing in really polarized spaces in Alberta, focusing on really transformative ideas. And we'll hear from Rebecca Keetch from Green Jobs Oshawa, which is a group proposing a transformation in the manufacturing industry so that we can prioritize making things we need rather than things that corporations can sell and make money on. I know that many people in the crowd tonight, maybe, oh my goodness, we're at almost 400 people. So we've got a huge crowd here, and I think I'm going to read between the lines and assume that many of you are working or interested in working on locally rooted initiatives and campaigns to drive a just transition and recovery from the pandemic, and in response to the climate crisis. So I hope that hearing these ideas, kind of high level, big ideas from Seth, and then rooted ground level grassroots ideas and stories of mobilization, I hope that these will inspire you a little bit, give you some food for thought, and that we'll all leave with some new ideas tonight. So first we'll hear from Rebecca from Green Jobs Oshawa, then we'll hear from Hannah from Climate Justice Edmonton, and then we'll hear from Seth. Then we'll have some time for question and answer. So if you haven't already, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. And if it's possible, if you can use the Q&A function for your questions, it's a little bit easier for us just to see those questions and pull them out so that we can pull them out when the time comes and do the question and answer together. Yeah, so I'm going to turn it over to our speakers now. We'll come back at the end with a couple opportunities to take action. I think we might all have a few suggestions of what folks in the audience can do next. And I think I said this in the beginning, but this session is being recorded so that we can share it later. It's also being live streamed on Facebook for folks who want to watch there. And yeah, if you're having any technical problems, please go to the chat and send a message to the host and we'll try to help you out. And I'm just so glad that for this conversation, we're being joined by 389 people, which is totally stunning to me. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to our speakers, and I'll turn it to Hannah from Climate Justice Edmonton to make some first remarks. Hannah?
Hey, sorry, I got mixed up because we were gonna have Rebecca go first, but I'm fine to just roll with this. It's all good. It's all good. Let's keep going. Yeah. Hi everyone. I have a little slideshow.
Sorry, Hannah, that was my mistake. Do you want to recalibrate and we'll toss to Rebecca?
I think let's just keep going. I think it's all
great.
Good.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Where are we here? There we go. Perfect. Right on. So as Robin said, my name is Hannah Gelderman. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm going to chat a little bit tonight about Climate Justice Edmonton, and kind of some of the stuff that we've been up to, and then kind of how we approach our work here in Alberta. I do want to start out with the territory acknowledgement. So I'm calling in from Treaty 6 territory. Amiskwaci Waskahigan is the Plains Cree name for Edmonton, which means Beaver Hills House. And this is Blackfoot, Cree, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, and Métis Nation territory. And for myself, I'm a settler of Dutch descent. And yeah, kind of as a settler and for Climate Justice Edmonton more broadly, we definitely recognize that we need to be anti-colonial and anti-racist in this work, and work to dismantle the systems of colonialism and white supremacy. And that, of course, this is a process that's ongoing and requires a lot of accountability, but we really strive to do our best in that. Yeah, and so Climate Justice Edmonton, maybe first I'll give a quick disclaimer too. I spent 2 years in Victoria, so a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, Climate Justice Edmonton, we, like I wasn't here for all of it. And I was doing some organizing in Victoria, and I saw a few familiar names in the chat and the participants. So yeah, but with Climate Justice Edmonton, we've been active for about 3.5 years. We kind of formed in 2018, coming out of the Greenpeace Edmonton local group that was organizing here, but we wanted a bit more of a localized approach. And so we founded Climate Justice Edmonton, and we're here fighting for climate justice in Alberta. And the group is made up of kind of a variety of folks, lots of students, people working. I'm an artist. We have, yeah, kind of some teachers, other people working as organizers in other contexts. So yeah, definitely a variety of folks working together. And over the last few years, we've done kind of a variety of projects and campaigns, a lot of speaking out against Kinder Morgan and Trans Mountain. We did a creative project called People on the Path, which was life-size portraits of people sharing their visions for what they would like to see in this province. We ran a candidate for the federal NDP nomination, Paige Gorsak. Unfortunately, she didn't win the nomination, but definitely that campaign galvanized a lot of people and was a way to bring a lot of conversations about what the future of Alberta could look like to people's doorsteps. And so other things are, we acted as a hub for Our Time, which was a 350 campaign in the lead up to the federal election. Worked with climate strikers to organize climate strikes, and also lots of solidarity work around Wet'suwet'en, working with a local group called Beaver Hills Warriors, also supporting initiatives like through Indigenous Climate Action and Migrante. So kind of, yeah, definitely a variety of things on the go. And then about a year and a half ago, a project of Climate Justice Edmonton emerged, Free Transit Edmonton. So they're independent in that they have their own campaign and social media and stuff, but also very much still connected as a campaign of Climate Justice Edmonton. So advocating for fair, free, and good transit as part of a Green New Deal. And then kind of other work that's a bit more broadly Green New Deal and talking about a Green New Deal for Alberta. And then a bit of Kenny resistance in there as well. So yeah, that's like a bit of an overview of some of the campaigns and projects. And then kind of within this, a lot of what we do is public education work, whether like during COVID webinars or different things, but kind of helping draw connections between issues, hosting opportunities for volunteers to get involved and trainings for volunteers. Different projects have had like different kind of canvassing and more kind of public outreach work. Yeah, different strategy sessions and planning sessions, and kind of also kind of honing and providing analysis. So certainly a variety of things. But definitely one of the big pieces, especially coming from a climate justice framework, is being able to, like I said, draw connections between issues. So explain why abolition is a climate justice issue, and why racial justice, migrant justice, why these are all a part of climate justice, why housing initiatives are important. And so definitely like, yeah, broadening the conversation, and that's like necessary from a moral standpoint, but also strategically, because the way we win this is having a broad-based movement that everyone can see themselves in. And yeah, and so definitely taking up that work to do that in action and also through education. And yeah, definitely we're doing this in the context of Alberta, where even when we've had the NDP in power, it's still very much like a pipelines narrative, like fossil fuel expansion narrative. And we're seeing a rise of kind of more white supremacist groups like the Yellow Vest, things like that. And right now with the provincial government in our Kenny, they're like full steam ahead on kind of in the opposite direction of what we would like to see. And at the same time, like increasing climate impacts in the province. So yeah, it certainly makes for a frustrating context, but at the same time, it makes the work that we're doing really stand out. And I do think over the past few years, there certainly has been a shift. Like more and more people are like, we need to be having honest conversation about the future of this province. But especially at the beginning and still, it's like the chances that we get to talk about and engage people in conversation about a different future for this province. I mean, sometimes there's backlash, but generally lots of people, are ready for this and they see the writing on the wall. And so this is just, I'm not going to get into the details, but some of the polling that Seth did for the book really indicated that there's a lot of public support for things like a Green New Deal, and a lot of, yeah, people are ready, and even in Alberta. And so when we're able to have these conversations and talk about what we want, there's generally people are like supportive of it, and it's a good way to engage people. And then of course there are the folks that are vocally opposed, but really working to also within our narratives, when like our narratives of the future of the province, talk about workers, and really ensure that, you know, we're not saying, oh, we are like shut down the tar sands today, like we need to stop expansion and have a managed decline, and a just transition would include supports for workers. And so really trying to, yeah, to make sure that those sorts of messages are getting across, as well as ways to engage people. And kind of another piece, I'm not going to get into all these, but just these are some different things from some of the social movement theory that we kind of, yeah, get in on, and definitely learning from successful movements like the Sunrise Movement in the States on ways to build our base. And as a small group, we're not always actively like base building, but the awareness of the fact that we are part of a movement, a global movement that's fighting for climate justice, and that there's a lot of strategy that goes into it, that we can leverage that strategy and that knowledge. Yeah, and really that what we're doing, kind of what Robin said at the beginning, is organizing to make it politically possible. And so by shifting the Overton window, shifting the public conversation, or playing a part in shifting the public conversation, hopefully we'll get to a point where political leaders in this province recognize that the public is very well and ready for a transition, and in fact like needs the leadership to make that happen. So yeah, that's kind of my quick overview. Certainly if there's questions, we'll get to that later. I can expand on any of those things, but just I have all of our kind of social media and contact info here, where folks, if you're not in the loop, you can always follow us on social media or check out the website for more info too. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you for going with the flow as I made a tiny error and introduced you first. That was very gracious of you. That was fantastic. I'm seeing lots of questions coming in the chat, so I just want to let people know again, we're collecting those, so we'll bring them all back in the question period. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it to Rebecca Keetch from Green Jobs Oshawa, who had intended to go first, but is here now. So Rebecca, take it away. I can't wait to hear more about your work in Oshawa.
Thank you. As I start my presentation, I first want to acknowledge that each of us are learning, working, and organizing on traditional and ancestral Indigenous territory. And I want us to acknowledge that we must have a commitment to reconciliation that compels us to learn and understand the history. I ask us to recognize the devastating destruction that history has caused and the ways it continues to damage the lives of so many. And I ask us to find ways to translate that knowledge and commitment into meaningful action. So I would like to ask the participants in this presentation tonight to do two things in the spirit of reconciliation. The first is to learn. Pick any of the far too numerous challenges that First Nations peoples have experienced and continue to experience in Canada and learn about it, whether it's the residential schools, the murdered and missing Aboriginal women, the mercury contamination and poisoning of the people of Grassy Narrows, the overrepresentation of First Peoples in the criminal justice system, or the lack of clean water. Just please make a conscious effort to learn. And the second is to take some sort of action to support the issue you have learned about. And this could include something simple like signing a petition, donating to a legal defense or a legal challenge, attending a rally, supporting a picket, or just sharing on social media the stories you have learned. But please do something. We aren't going to have a better future if we don't make a serious attempt at reconciliation. I'd also like to take a moment to really thank the Council of Canadians for giving Green Jobs Oshawa the opportunity to share our story here tonight, and for hosting such an important conversation with Climate Justice Edmonton and Seth Klein on Mobilizing Canada for the climate emergency. So, Who is Green Jobs Oshawa? Green Jobs Oshawa is a coalition of workers, environmentalists, academics, and community members. We came together in response to the announcement by General Motors that they were closing the Oshawa assembly plant. We recognized, in the midst of a climate crisis requiring immediate action and a community facing massive job loss and disruption, the need for a bold idea. We called for public ownership of the GM plant for production of battery electric vehicles or other socially beneficial production that would prioritize social needs over corporate greed. Now, General Motors had been producing vehicles in their facility in Oshawa for just over 100 years. It has an area of approximately 10 million square feet and has produced in excess of 20 million vehicles. It was one of the most decorated, productive, and efficient plants in North America. On November 26, 2018, GM announced that the Oshawa facility would be unallocated. On December 18, 2019, the last truck rolled off the line and thousands in Oshawa and the surrounding community were left unemployed. When GM announced the closure of the Oshawa facility, there was anger and outrage from the community and across Canada, but almost no political response. Doug Ford, our premier, shrugged his shoulders and said, "The ship has already left the dock." And Justin Trudeau promised support for workers, but took no action to keep people working. Unifor, the workers' union, expressed outrage and vowed to keep the plant open. The union launched an expansive media campaign, which included TV and newspaper ads that shamed GM for leaving Canada after taking billions in a taxpayer bailout. They also called for a boycott of Mexican-made GM vehicles. There were lawn signs, t-shirts, and banner actions. GM, which employed over 17,000 hourly workers at its height, had less than 2,500 hourly workers when it announced the closure. GM's withdrawal from Oshawa was painful, particularly in light of the brutal attack on workers' wages and working conditions as the corporation demanded concessions for continuing product and employment. In 2009, GM of Canada received almost $11 billion in government assistance to keep the company afloat. The company and the Canadian government demanded major concessions from workers to secure the bailout money. While GM rapidly returned to profitability and made billions of dollars in profit, workers did not regain any of their losses and, in fact, continued losing ground. The threat of closure had hung over the Oshawa facility for years. In May 2019, the union agreed to call off its campaign in exchange for GM maintaining aftermarket parts production that secured approximately 300 jobs. Unifor noted that this agreement would also keep the plant viable for future production. Then, in 2020, just a year after GM successfully shed the previously well-established workforce and upended the lives of thousands more through the supply chain, they announced new truck production at the Oshawa facility. While jobs coming to the community is significant and desperately needed, the return of truck production by GM is also problematic. The jobs that are returning are not the same good jobs that left. GM will be restarting truck production with a workforce that will be 90% low-wage, second and third tier workers with no defined benefit pensions, inferior benefits, and no job security. It also leaves the power to make future decisions impacting the community in the hands of a corporation only driven by profit. And it doesn't address the fact that there is no long-term future for gas-powered pickup trucks in a time of climate crisis. However, there was another strategy with long-term benefits that should have been pursued by the government in Unifor that was neglected. Conversion of the plant under public ownership for socially beneficial manufacturing and a transition to a sustainable future. Green Jobs Oshawa took up that call, and our message resonated with many. The foundation of this vision is that there is a climate crisis, which requires decisive and bold action on a scale that must be mandated by government. Individuals cannot do this alone. We must recognize that decisions based on corporate profits are not in the best interest of workers, communities, or society. We believe that manufacturing capacity must be protected and is essential to the sustainability of our future so that we are able to respond quickly and effectively to challenges. However, that manufacturing should not be done for profit, which is why we promote a publicly owned Crown corporation. To bring this vision to life, we commissioned a preliminary feasibility study based on a triple bottom line. Economic, social, and environmental benefits were all considered to make the case that battery electric fleet vehicles anchored in government procurement and publicly owned could be a viable model within 5 years that could reduce CO2 emissions by 400,000 metric tons, create up to 13,000 good jobs, and be self-sufficient. This is just one example of what could be done with a nationalized facility. And then the COVID-19 crisis came, and unsurprisingly, the foundations of our call for government intervention at the GM Oshawa facility became even more relevant and urgent as Canadians quickly became aware of how unprepared we were for this pandemic. Global supply chains vanished, and lives have been put at risk and lost due to inadequate social planning and manufacturing strategies. It is dangerous, as this pandemic has demonstrated, to not be self-reliant for the necessities that meet the basic health and safety needs of our population. So Green Jobs Oshawa called for the production of essential medical equipment and supplies at the Oshawa complex. We were excited when it was announced that GM would be producing 10 million masks at its Oshawa plant under a government contract for cost, not profit. Although we felt that this was not enough in light of the desperate shortages of PPE, this contract and conversion were very significant. It was a modern illustration that it is possible to quickly convert manufacturing capacity to address social need instead of profit when there is political will. It was a concrete example of what can be done. However, we continued to call for more. Green Jobs Oshawa joined with the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions and the Ontario Council of Hospital Unions to issue a joint statement calling on the government to mandate production of N95 respirators at the GM Oshawa facility, just as GM has been doing at their plant in Michigan. The statement noted, "It remains remarkable that during this health crisis, there have only been incentives, but no direct pressure on companies to convert their facilities to address this social emergency. What has been needed in this emergency was not subsidies and incentives, but decisive government action, comprehensive planning, and the use of emergency powers to mandate the conversion of manufacturing plants to prioritize public needs." Now, of course, this is the same scale of action that is needed to address the climate crisis before us. With the climate catastrophe, we are facing a crisis that requires massive mobilization of government resources to survive. This is not unprecedented. As Seth lays out in his excellent book, during the World War, we saw government take similar large-scale action as is currently needed. Our economy was quickly retooled and no expense was spared in the effort. And we are living through a real-time mobilization and response on a massive scale as we watch global action taken to fight COVID-19. We know the government is capable of taking action when it wants to. We have also seen how quickly public money can materialize when there is a political emergency. We have to ask, why isn't the climate crisis and a just transition a political emergency? We know some other things our government doesn't consider a political emergency. It isn't our elderly dying in for-profit long-term care homes. It hasn't been the loss of manufacturing and the hundreds of thousands of good jobs lost with it. It isn't public transportation to decongest our cities and highways. And it certainly isn't the climate crisis and a just transition to protect workers and communities. The only thing our government seems to consider an emergency is the economic threats to profits. Threats to profits are always a terrible crisis that require bold, decisive government action. We've seen it with the auto bailouts and now again in this pandemic as billions are funneled to private corporations with little strings attached. So when we are told that it isn't possible to take the dramatic and large-scale actions that are necessary to drive a just transition, we must reject that immediately because we know better. Governments must be transformed to look after people instead of corporations. We need our government to abandon the notion that profitable corporations mean secure communities. They don't. Wealthy corporations do not mean healthy communities. But to mobilize and make this happen, we must truly center the calls for a just transition around workers and community. We must address workers' concerns in a serious way. We know there are no jobs on a dead planet, but we must also recognize the immediate needs of people to survive are equally pressing. Our world is changing quickly. We need to expand the role of public services and quit relying on a piecemeal network that is based on making the rich richer. Corporations continue to show complete disregard for environmental and social devastation caused in the pursuit of profits, and they won't stop if we don't make them. If workers and communities don't fight to be part of the conversation, they are going to get left out. The evidence that the environmental crisis threatens the planet is irrefutable, and it demands immediate, decisive, collective action. Labor and communities must demand government at all levels take immediate action to accelerate our transition to a carbon-free economy. The climate crisis is going to change everything about how we work, live, and play, whether we are ready or not. I would rather be ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm just seeing lots of people in the chat expressing a lot of appreciation and enthusiasm for what you're saying, and some folks asking for your speaking notes because they want to read them. So maybe we'll share some information with them about where they can find more from you after. Thank you so much. I always love hearing about the vision that Green Jobs Oshawa is putting forward because it's so tangible, it's so understandable, but it is so drastically different than what we're experiencing today. And it really cuts across a lot of issues to address a lot of different types of things with one very concrete, understandable solution. So that is brilliant. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And without further ado, I will turn it to Seth Klein, author of A Good War, who's going to give us some insights from his new book, what lessons we can learn from mobilizing during wartime and how we can apply those lessons here in the climate crisis. So Seth, please take it away.
Thank you, Robin. Am I coming through okay? Great. Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for your interest in joining this event. It's absolutely thrilling to see so many of you have tuned in, Zoom fatigue notwithstanding. I'm joining you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, otherwise known as East Vancouver. I'm really happy to be doing this for the Council of Canadians, an organization that I've been a supporter of since the mid-1990s. And after my many years with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, there was always lots of connections between our groups. And in partnership with the folks from Green Jobs Oshawa and Climate Justice Edmonton, both those groups are groups I have great admiration for, and they're both in the book, by the way. So I've been asked to offer some opening comments about the book. I'm going to speak for 20 minutes. Really appreciate hearing from Rebecca and Hannah, and then we'll have time for discussion. This is the book, by the way. So my book calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach to the climate crisis than the one that we've pursued to date. And I've endeavored to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis that we face. But in all of the feedback that I've had from folks since the book came out in September, people are saying what I hope they were going to say, which is that they're finding it an unusually hopeful book, notwithstanding the dire subject matter. The original twist of the book, as the title suggests, and as Robin said off the top, is that the book is structured entirely around lessons from the Second World War. Now, some of you on this call know me, and you know that there's no small irony in me coming from this place. I, like many of you, I'm sure, wrestle with this war analogy. My own political activism started as a teenager in the peace and disarmament movement in the 1980s. Moreover, I am the child of Vietnam War resistors. That is how I happen to be Canadian. But I am now strongly of the view that climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society and galvanize our politics and to fundamentally remake our economy. And here's why. The opening premise of the book is that we need a new approach because what we have been doing in response to the climate crisis thus far isn't working. If you look at Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back for the last 20 years, what you see is a flat line. You know, emissions are no longer climbing, but neither are they in decline. To put this in the parlance that we've all come to know in this pandemic, we have failed to bend the curve. Despite decades of calls to action, our emissions are not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our children and future generations. Where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we have accomplished precious little. And so here we all are, confronting this harrowing gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. I didn't start off planning to write a war story. My book project began as an exploration of what we do about that gap and how we can align our politics and economy in Canada with what the science says we have to urgently do. And the book is that, by the way. But initially I had planned only to have a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War, because I'd long been intrigued by World War II as an example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved into that research, I began to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience and the current crisis, and ultimately decided to structure the entire book around lessons from our wartime experience, because I see in that history this helpful and indeed hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across society to confront an existential threat. And in doing so, we've retooled the entire economy twice, in fact, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. And so the book explores what wartime scale climate mobilization could actually mean and look like. And each chapter jumps back and forth in time between those wartime stories and the present. And in these comparisons, it answers questions like, how has public opinion rallied to support mobilization in the war? What are the lessons for doing that today? What was the role of government, the news media, arts and culture? How was social solidarity secured across class and race and gender? And can we do that again? How is national unity established across Canada's provinces with all of their differing interests? And can we successfully achieve that again as we now move off fossil fuels? How did we marshal all of our resources to produce what was needed? How do we do that again? How did we pay for that transformation in the war? And can we mobilize the necessary finances again? And this touches to something Robin mentioned off the top. What were the supports that were offered to returning soldiers? And is there a model there for just transition for fossil fuel workers today? What was the role of Indigenous people in the war? And what is it in today's transformation? What was the role of youth and social movements then and now? But importantly as well, while much of the book, lauds the story of our wartime experience, there are also a couple chapters there about the war's cautionary tales, the warnings of things that brought us shame, the internments, the squashing of civil rights, the poisoning of Indigenous lands, and I think most apt to the current crisis, the response to refugees. So those things that we don't want to repeat. And running through it all, what sort of political leadership do we require to see us through challenges like this? And I'll start with one important comparison I make because it gives me some hope and it speaks to something Robin mentioned off the top. It's this, which is that, despite Canada's war declaration in September of 1939, it's worth recalling that even as the winds of war gathered in the late 1930s, our leaders, and in fact, much of the public, were reluctant to recognize what would ultimately be necessary, a lot like today. Canada was on the cusp of being completely transformed by its Second World War experience. Yet right up to the 11th hour, our government and most of the public still hoped to avoid getting dragged into that fight. And I feel like that's where we are today in this similar awkward period where, 2 summers ago, Justin Trudeau's government passes a climate emergency motion in the House of Commons one day and then reapproves the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion the very next day. that is something, a dynamic that I call the new climate denialism. And it's a concept I unpack in the book. But as with the Second World War, I'm convinced that this, if you will, phony war period isn't going to last. Historians refer to the first 9 months of World War II as the phony war. We declared war, but not a lot happened initially. I feel like that's where we are today. But like then, it won't last. But this is one of the book's important lessons, is that emergencies, once they are recognized, transform society and our economy and our leaders. If you had said to Canadians in 1938, you know, this gang in Mackenzie King's cabinet, do they have what it takes to completely transform the economy and society and social relations, as was about to happen? I'm quite certain that most Canadians would have said, no, not this gang, they don't have it in them. And what evidence did they have to think otherwise? And similarly, if you had said to me a year ago, you know, are there people in the Bank of Canada and at Finance Canada who can quickly pivot and create these audacious new programs like the wage subsidy and the CERB? I'm pretty sure I would have said no, you know, that there's no one home who thinks that way. And I would have been wrong. So similarly, there wasn't unity in Canada in 1939 about what had to happen, but it came. But it took work. And we've just lived through that again, I think, in this pandemic. After 40 years of a neoliberal agenda that has, I think, as its most insidious legacy, the sapping of our sense of possibility and imagination and our collective faith and our capacity to undertake great tasks together. The pandemic emergency has shown us how quickly we can change our ways and how swiftly we can just throw out the economic rule book. And so in some important ways, our sense of imagination is restored. Ever since I released the book in September, you know, I've done a lot of events now and a lot of interviews, and invariably I get asked the question, how do you know when a government gets the emergency? And so in answering that question, I've been forced to distill a 400-page book into what I call my 4 markers of when you know that a government has shifted into an emergency mode. And when I stop talking and we move to Q&A, I'll put a link in the chat for an article in which I summarize these 4 markers, but I'll tell you what they are now. Here are the 4 markers. Number 1, it spends what it takes to win. Number 2, it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. Number 3, it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed. And number 4, it tells the truth. It tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. Think on those 4 markers. During the Second World War, the Canadian government did all of those things. And I would say in this pandemic, the Trudeau government actually, you know, passes all 4 of those markers. But with respect to the climate emergency, so far anyway, neither our federal government nor any provincial government of any political stripe hits any of those 4 markers. So I want to explore each of those 4 markers with you, along with a couple other key lessons from our Second World War experience. In the book, I group all of these lessons into what I call the battle plan for climate mobilization. It's a 14-point plan outlining what it looks like to adopt an emergency mindset and do what it takes to win. I'm not going to walk you through all 14 points, don't worry. That would take too long, but I want to highlight a few, starting with those 4 markers. So marker number 1, spend what it takes to win. A benefit of an emergency mentality is that it forces governments out of an austerity mindset. So this year, in response to the pandemic, Canada's debt to GDP ratio is going to increase from about 30% to 50%. Now that's a big jump in a single year. But consider that at the end of the Second World War, it was more than double that. It was well over 100%. And when C.D. Howe was the minister in the Mackenzie King government who oversaw all of Canada's wartime production and oversaw what was a tenfold increase in government spending. And when he was pressed about all of that government spending, he famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter." And in order to finance that war effort, the government issued public victory bonds and new forms of progressive taxation were instituted, including a cap on profits, by the way. So the kind of profiteering that we've seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. And I think as we confront the climate emergency, we're going to need to employ similar tools. However, the federal spending on climate action and green infrastructure to date pales in comparison to both the war and the pandemic response. The Trudeau government isn't just spending a little less than it should in the face of the climate emergency, it's spending less by a massive order of magnitude. Just to give you two numbers to illustrate, since the lockdown, the first lockdown a year ago, the Bank of Canada has been purchasing government securities in order to finance the pandemic response to the tune of $5 billion a week. In contrast, the Trudeau government is spending in response to the climate emergency about $5 billion a year. That just gives you a taste of the difference. The second marker, create the new economic institutions needed to get the job done. So during the Second World War, starting from a base of virtually nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment that's just jaw-dropping. During those 6 years, Canada, with a population less than a third what it is today, produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the fourth largest air force in the world at the time. Here in my province, where we seem unable to build a single BC ferry anymore, we produced over 300 ships, again, from a base of almost nothing. And remarkably, the Canadian government, under the leadership of C.D. Howe, in order to expedite doing that, established 28 crown corporations to meet that wartime production effort. And Howe became this intriguing figure to me. He's no lefty, right? He's on the right wing of the Mackenzie King cabinet. He'd made a lot of money in the private sector, but he was seized with the task at hand. And he was in a hurry. So anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what was needed, he created another crown enterprise. His department also undertook detailed economic planning to ensure wartime production was prioritized. But in response to the climate emergency, we've seen nothing of this sort. So in contrast to all of those wartime creations, the Trudeau government has established in its time in office 2 new crown corporations. The first is the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is basically a vehicle for privatizing infrastructure. And you know what the second one is, I hate to tell you, it's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. It's the one that makes us all the shared owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline from Hannah's province to mine. If our government really saw the climate emergency as an emergency, it would, like C.D. Howe did, quickly conduct an inventory of our conversion needs to determine how many heat pumps and solar arrays and wind farms and electric buses we're going to need to electrify virtually everything and end our reliance on fossil fuels. And then it would establish a new generation of public corporations to ensure that those items are manufactured and deployed at the requisite scale. And in the book, I have like a 3-page list of what those corporations could be. And another new institution, I think we need a new federal climate emergency just transition transfer to overcome the challenges of confederation and to make a concrete just transition offer to those provinces that have the most heavy lifting to do. Maybe we'll talk more about that in Q&A. Marker number 3, shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. As I explained earlier, last 20 years, Canada's emissions have just flatlined. Why is that? I'm convinced that the main reason is that if you survey Canada and all of our federal and provincial climate actions to date, they all have one thing in common. They're voluntary. We encourage change. We incentivize change. We offer rebates. We send price signals. What we have decidedly not done is require change. If we're going to meet the ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets that we now need to, we need to set clear near-term dates by which certain things will be required. For example, we would declare that it will no longer be legal to sell new fossil fuel burning vehicles as of 2025. We would mandate that all new buildings will not be permitted to use natural gas for heating as of next year. We would ban advertising by fossil fuel vehicles and gas stations. That's how we would make clear that this is serious. And just to build on Rebecca's wonderful presentation, to give you a sense of what kind of rapid vehicle transition can happen with the political will, consider this. In the Second World War, in the US, Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. In February of 1942, 2 months later, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in Detroit, and for the next 4 years, the production and sale of them was illegal. Now, those plants were plenty busy pumping out what was needed for the war effort, but that rapid transition didn't happen because of the goodwill and patriotism of the big three automakers. It happened because they were ordered to do so. Marker number 4, tell the truth and rally the public at every turn. So a lot of us assumed that at the outbreak of war, everyone understood the threat and was ready to rally. And it turns out that's not true. It took leadership to mobilize the public. In frequency and in tone, in words and in action, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. And the leaders that we most remember from the Second World War were these outstanding communicators who were forthright with the public about the gravity of the crisis, and yet still managed to impart hope. And their messages were amplified by a news media that knew what side of history it wanted to be on, and by an arts and entertainment sector keen to rally the public. And again, we've all just lived through this in the last 12 months, right? Where our governments have modeled what emergency communication is supposed to look like. The messages are ubiquitous. We receive daily press briefings. We hear regularly from public health officials. The media has taken seriously its duty to provide necessary information on a daily basis, and they don't feel any compulsion to give equal time to the other side. None of that consistency and coherence is present with respect to the climate emergency. And when our governments don't act as if the situation is an emergency, or worse, when they send contradictory messages by approving new fossil fuel infrastructure, they're effectively communicating to the public that it's not an emergency. And if our current leaders believe we face an emergency, they need to act and speak like it's a damn emergency. Robin asked me to speak about the lack of political will in Canada and what to make of it. And it is true that the curse of the climate crisis relative to COVID and relative to the war is that it moves in slower motion. But I still think that political will can be brought to bear. I interviewed a lot of politicians and political insiders for my book research, and I was only interested in interviewing ones who I think accept the science, and yet whose governments and parties aren't doing what needs to be done. And when you press them on this, they all fall back on some rejoinder of the line, well, you got to meet the public where they're at, and the public's not there yet. I found this a very annoying response because the leaders we remember from World War II didn't meet the public where they're at. They took the public where they needed to go. But I also wanted to test the proposition, and so I commissioned an original poll from Abacus Data, and what that poll revealed is that in fact our politicians weren't giving the public credit. It revealed a public that is ahead of our politics when it comes both to understanding the emergency and their willingness to accept truly bold climate action. But I want to share one other story that illustrates how political will is possible, and that it needn't be a political wedge issue, that we can find unity. And it's from my own city in Vancouver. Now, I'm very biased in telling this story because, well, the hero of the story is my wife, who is a Vancouver City Councillor, Christine Boyle, and who moved the climate emergency motion in Vancouver 2 years ago. It was the first in English Canada. And many cities have followed suit. A lot of these municipal climate emergency motions are just symbolic, but the Vancouver one is not. It has resulted in what many feel is the most ambitious climate plan municipally anywhere in North America. But the interesting piece about this story is that even though Vancouver has a very politically disparate city council, no party has a majority, you never know how this gang's going to vote on anything, it passed unanimously. Now, how did that happen? I think part of it is that, of course, Chris is very good at her job, but she would say that it happened because when those votes happened, dozens of high school students skipped class, they rallied outside, they spoke before council, they filled the galleries, and they basically made it politically impossible for even the conservative councillors to vote no. And so in Vancouver, it isn't a political wedge issue. It's across the board. I want to quickly offer two other lessons that I think are very relevant to all of you who are Green New Deal organizers out there. The first is that inequality itself is toxic to social solidarity and mass mobilization. There are all these, there's climate policy purists out there who say, don't link climate action with tackling inequality and social justice. Don't make it more complicated. I think they're wrong, not only because these issues are very linked. The richer you are, the higher your emissions, the poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are, but also because that's how we win. This is what the King government appreciated at the beginning of the Second World War, is that if they were actually going to get everyone on board, if they were going to have cross-society mobilization, it wasn't enough just to tell people to go sign up and fight these people across the ocean. They had to make a commitment to that the society that people were going to come back to was going to look different than the one they were leaving behind. And so they increased taxes on the wealthy, and they brought in Canada's first social programs, major income transfer programs, unemployment insurance, the family allowance come in during the war, the Marsh Report that lays the groundwork for the whole post-war social welfare system is brought in during the war and is offered up to Canadians as this pledge that the society is going to look different, all of which has an echo in the appeal of the Green New Deal today. When you link tackling climate change with taking ambitious action on inequality, support for the bold climate action doesn't go down, it goes through the roof. And the other key lesson is leave no one behind. And to me, this relates to the issue of jobs. There's about 200,000 Canadians today who are directly employed in the fossil fuel industry. That's a lot. But one of the things I try to pull out of the war story is, again, we did something much more challenging then. Canada was a population of 11 million people in the war. Over 1 million people enlisted in military service, and more than that were directly employed in munitions production. All those people had to be recruited and trained up and then reintegrated into a peacetime economy afterwards. And we created audacious programs to do that around income support and housing support and post-secondary support programs that transformed the post-secondary sector and changed the lives of thousands of people. If we could do all of that then, we can certainly do that again today. And I just want to leave you with one final thought before we open this up. Just as the Second World War ended the Great Depression, as we rebuild from this pandemic, an ambitious climate plan with massive green infrastructure spending, a Green New Deal, can be just what the doctor ordered for our economy. The vital and urgent challenge now is to ensure that we use the experience and opening that this pandemic has created to catapult us into a post-carbon economy, to use it, as Arundhati Roy says, as a portal or a gateway into between one world and the next. But I also want to highlight one notable difference between the pandemic and this climate crossroads moment. People talk about COVID fatigue, and that's real. And some people have responded to my thesis by saying, look how quickly we've tired of emergency in the pandemic in less than a year. And now you're asking people to spend multiple years in emergency mode tackling the climate crisis. But here's the distinction. The things we are called upon to do in response to the pandemic are anathema to all of our social instincts. We're told to isolate, to stay home, and that's been hard. But the good news about the climate mobilization is that it calls on us to do precisely the opposite, which is to get out there and do something grand together. Well, thanks. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much. Sorry. Pardon me. Thank you so much.
Did I make you cry?
Never
mind.
No, I just, I realized without speaking for at least a few minutes, my throat just got all weird. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I'm crying. It's great. That was super inspirational. We have tons of questions. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Seth, for those wise words, and Hannah and Rebecca as well. Seth, I think you've just been elected PM, or you've been nominated for 2023, or maybe we'll have an election in the spring, but that's going on in the chat. And while this has been going on, I've been collecting the questions that are coming in from all of you. And before we get to that, I just want to open it and see if any of the panelists have a question for another panelist. And then we'll open it to questions from the crowd. Does anyone have any questions for each other?
I'd like to ask Seth, I guess, just two questions. And I guess if Hannah could jump in too, is how important is the role of improving public transportation in tackling this crisis? And what are some tangible ways that we can amplify the messages that we're talking about tonight? So I know you've talked about before, Seth, I've heard you speak. You said one of the things you like about the pandemic is that it has demonstrated the government does know how to talk about a crisis, right? So what are some things that we would like to see happening around that?
And maybe while you're asking that question, I'll tag on. There were some questions in the chat about transportation. Some folks were noting that there's a concern about an over-reliance on personal electric vehicles rather than decreasing our overall use of electric vehicles. And then some questions about like private profit and benefit of producing electric vehicles. So maybe if it's okay, I'll just wrap that in with Rebecca's question and then we can discuss that a little bit.
Hannah, did you want to go, or do you want me to jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, at the risk of just telling you to read the book, I would say, so I do speak to this question of the transition that has to happen with respect to transportation. And I think the questioner is quite right that it has to be more than just saying switch from combustion engines to electric engines. It's got to be something much deeper than that around changing, first of all, how we actually construct our communities and creating complete communities where people are able to, get to their work and leisure and services within a walk and a roll. And then shifting from individual to collective. So that's why I was particularly keen with the Green Jobs Oshawa proposal, that it wasn't simply about switching to straight up electric, but actually with a focus on public vehicle fleets the way they have. So I think the highest priority should be figuring out how to domestically manufacture electric buses. And facilitating that switch. Those are just some of the switches. I mean, there's all kinds of further transportation shifts. I mean, electric bikes is another piece of all of it, which, speaking from experience, is like massively transformative in terms of what it allows. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Hannah, did you want to add anything there?
I will say I haven't done a lot of work specifically with Free Transit Edmonton, so I'm probably not the best spokesperson, but I do know that they've had lots of conversations with James Wilt, who's written a book, The Android's Dream of Electric Cars, I think, and from my understanding, I haven't read that either, but I want to, is that, yeah, he really talks about like a vision that isn't reliant on personal vehicles. And so in terms of, yeah, public, like car shares, and yeah, massive investments in public transit. So I think in terms of like a vision of how transit could be, I think that's a good resource, and something kind of like on the far end of like no more personal vehicles. There's not a lot of conversation that we hear that. So
thanks. So I think I'll go to the questions that have been raised through the chat. I've been keeping a few and trying to bunch them together because many of them are kind of related. So I'm wondering, first, folks were asking, should we not be including penalties for not meeting specific emissions reductions and other goals by certain dates? And I'm wondering also, are there any current legislative or other opportunities that panelists are seeing that we should be taking advantage of?
Well, I mean, so first of all, I when I say we need clear dates, well, all of these policies are a mix of carrots and sticks, right? You need to both, by carrots, I mean incentives, but in particular, I think we should be doing a much better job of focusing incentives on lower income households who actually need the help with the transition. And on the flip side, sticks, which is clear dates by which you just have no choice. And that's at the transition level. So I don't think we need to punish, as it were, people for not doing certain things. The point is to actually put the onus on industry and government itself and say, this is why, for example, I say Vancouver's plan is an actual climate emergency plan. In Vancouver, new houses, new buildings of any kind will not be able to use natural gas for space and water heating as of next year. Not 10 years from now, next year. So that's it's no longer an issue of personal choice. That's the law. That's the rule. That's the building code in Vancouver. But I also heard in the question, I think the questioner may have been alluding to Bill C-12 as well, which is this new federal accountability law that is just going to go into second reading later this week. And this is the net zero law. So it's the law by which the feds are saying we'll be accountable to get to net zero by 2050. And then it starts to set these 5-year benchmarks. The problem is that the first benchmark isn't until 1930. Which is ridiculous. And so the bill clearly needs major amendments. And this is a very concrete thing that all of us can do is tonight, contact your MP and say, you want to see Bill C-12 pass before an election, but not the way it is. It's got to be amended so that there's real accountability there.
I'll say I just put a petition that we're running about C-12 in the chat if anyone wants to also make it available afterwards.
Oh, and if I may, I had promised to share my article about the 4 markers in the chat, which I have just done. And I'm also going to give a link to my site with the book, which has some of my other stuff on all of this.
Great. And for all the links that are in the chat, we can make them available to folks afterwards. I'm going to send a follow-up email, so I'll include all the bits and bobs that we're talking about here. Some other questions that I'm seeing, one was for Hannah, and maybe anyone else who has experience with this. You folks have been canvassing in Edmonton and Alberta, and folks are wondering how much backlash you're getting there and how you prepare the canvassers for working with that tension.
Mm-hmm. Well, I did type a quick answer. So to be honest, most of the canvassing we've been doing is in like more progressive parts of Edmonton. So the riding where we've had a NDP MP for a number of years, and so it kind of sets it up well where people are generally more receptive. And so I think, yeah, it would be great to take some of these conversations to other areas of the city and province, which isn't something that we have really done. But I also think, I mean, just in terms of preparing people, yeah, kind of entering into a conversation, like being able to listen to, absolutely, and like asking people if you're canvassing what issues what issues they care about, and kind of using that as a starting point to be like, oh, well, actually the Green New Deal can address that sort of thing. Or yeah, primarily it's been canvassing around Green New Deal or for Page. So yeah, I think I'll just keep it short at that.
If I may weigh in on this one too, climate organizing in Alberta is hard. Let's just recognize that. But thank you, Hannah, for sharing that poll of mine with Abacus during your talk. The Abacus poll found that support for bold climate action ranges from a high in Quebec to a low in Alberta. But even in Alberta, it's pretty darn good. The slide that Hannah showed you was that even in Alberta, 50% of the public, once they're given a definition of the Green New Deal, say, yeah, sounds good, sign me up. That's pretty good. So I think the lesson there is don't let Jason Kenney define the political culture of that province. It's much more nuanced than he would have us believe, or that the political map falsely tells us. But that said, this is where I think, and I'm trying to get at with this idea for a new federal transfer, a just transition federal transfer. Most federal transfers are divvy up the money by head, by population. I think this one should divvy up the money by greenhouse gas emissions. So Alberta is responsible for about 40% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, way more than their share of the population. I would freeze that in time and give them 40% of the money for the next 10 years, and a lot of money. I think this should be like $20 to $40 billion a year. But here's the catch. I wouldn't send the money to Jason Kenney because he's not to be trusted. Instead, I think this is what I mean by new economic institutions. We need new just transition agencies in every province, jointly governed by every level of government and Indigenous nations and workers and businesses and climate experts, but where we can be assured that the money is going to be used on investments in green infrastructure and in retraining, but it would recognize the fact that the GHG profile of every province is a little different. So let those provinces decide the best way to deploy the money. But this is a way to concretely make the promise of just transition more than the hollow promise it's been for so many decades for so many people.
Thanks for that. We're nearing the end of our time, so I'm just trying to prioritize a few questions that are kind of common. I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all of them, but I think we've got some really good ones. A question I have for any of the panelists who want to answer, how do you deal with corporate pushback when government tries to move away from fossil fuels, but fossil fuel corporations and other major corporate players have a different idea? What can we do about that?
Well, just to quote FDR from the years just before the war, you welcome their hate. This is one of the problems we're up against, is that our governments are still in a mode of trying to appease the fossil fuel industry, and I use the term advisedly when I say appease, a la Chamberlain. Even those who purport to get the climate emergency. When you look at how they structure so many of their advisory committees, even in my province, they still have fossil fuel corporate reps on these committees, which means to say they're trying to devise climate plans with which the fossil fuel industry can find comfort. The hour's too late for that. Any climate plan with which they find comfort isn't worth having. And we need to be more aggressive about that and bring on the fight a little bit on that score.
Rebecca or Hannah, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just say, I think some of our work through Climate Justice Edmonton is is talking about those contradictions, and being critical of these climate plans that industry is okay with, and kind of, because I think certainly not everyone, but a portion of the general public would be like, oh yeah, okay, great, we got a climate plan. And so to push, to help with some of the education work around that, whether it's through social media or in whatever ways, but kind of doing the education so that hopefully people will put more pressure on the government to have a better plan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's important to remember how important it is to have interactions with the people who represent you, whether it's municipally, federally, or provincially. So if there are things that are concerning you, it's really important to have those conversations, not just through a petition, but if you have the time to write a letter or an email or pick up the phone and call your representatives, because it's one thing that elected people aren't fans of, is getting too much heat put on them directly by their constituents. So you turn up the heat, it's going to make them uncomfortable too.
Definitely. And I'm not a panelist, but I'll jump in here anyway. The Council of Canadians we've put a lot of time and energy into combating the very tight and problematic relationship between corporate players, especially from the fossil fuel industry, and their tight grip on all kinds of government decision-making processes. And a lot of that is about public awareness and engaging people in conversation about, did you know those facts you're getting are actually coming straight from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, whose sole interest is protecting the profits of their members. So we do quite a lot of work on that. If anyone's interested, you can get in touch with me or check out our website. I think we've got one more question and then we need to wrap it up. And this is a really good one. Recognizing that the people on this panel we're not Indigenous peoples, but we've talked a lot about the importance of focusing on including and engaging or like very meaningfully including Indigenous people and taking leadership from Indigenous communities about how we address the climate crisis. Does anyone have any comments or ideas about how we can make this transition while centering Indigenous peoples and marginalized and racialized peoples whose territories hold the resources that are required to make this transition? Big question.
Well, I mean, I have lots of thoughts on this, and actually, the chapter in the book on Indigenous leadership's one of my favorite because it pulls together a bunch of threads in the whole of the book, and it's trying to argue very strongly that there is no winning this thing without affirming and respecting Indigenous rights and title for a number of reasons. And by the way, there is also really some interesting World War II Indigenous history in the book there too, but time isn't going to allow me to go into it. But first of all, about 20% of the renewable energy projects in the country are actually happening under Indigenous leadership. And on the flip side, what we have seen in the past number of years is that as our politics, our mainstream politics dithers and dodges on climate and pursues all these contradictory policies over and over and over again, it is the assertion of Indigenous rights and title that is blocking fossil fuel and delaying fossil fuel infrastructure and effectively buying us time until our mainstream politics comes into alignment with what the science says we have to do. And so part of the solution is around embedding the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People at every level of government, and secondarily ensuring, unlike occurred in the war, that Indigenous communities are full partners in the development of our climate emergency plans.
Rebecca or Hannah, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think again, coming from a grassroots group perspective, it's like certainly important work for us to be doing like internally, like I kind of said with my acknowledgement around how we need to do our own anti-racist work, and then also show up in solidarity with Indigenous and racialized groups who are on the forefront of calling for justice, and really again doing the education piece around like why these issues are important. And so yeah, certainly that's not all of it, but I think those are some important things that we're really trying to work on.
I can add to this as well as an approach that we have used is to try to connect. So the Council of Canadians is a chapter-based organization. We have people all over the country, and we run national campaigns, but we also work on a lot of local stuff that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And a strategy and an approach we've used is to encourage our members in all kinds of locations to connect with local Indigenous struggles and other struggles of racialized communities where they live. And I think it's important to understand that the struggles of Indigenous and other marginalized peoples are very diverse across the country. And in connecting with something I've learned a lot through connecting with different Indigenous struggles is that there are a lot of different Indigenous nations in Canada. It's not one monolithic Indigenous group. There's over 100 independent and unique nations that have their own kind of approaches and histories and types of governance and relationship to the different lands where they are. And so I would encourage everyone here who's working or thinking about working on any kind of transitional work in their place, my suggestion would be to try to learn about local Indigenous struggles where you live in the nation of the people whose land you are living on. So for me, I'm out here on the East Coast and I work a lot in solidarity with Mi'kmaq nations. And of course, I see a lot of other struggles happening across the country, and I recognize that the ones happening here are a bit unique because they're happening here in the Mi'kmaq Nation. which are different than the struggles on the West Coast, for example. So I would invite anyone who has questions about that to get in touch with me or anyone at the Council of Canadians, and we can start trying to muddle through that together, and we'll be muddling for a long time, I'm sure. So we got a couple minutes left, so I'll start wrapping us up. I am blown away by how many people took time out of their days today to join this conversation with us, and I really want to thank Hannah and Rebecca and Seth for lending us their wisdom for this great conversation. People say this phrase a lot: to change everything, we need everyone. I don't know who said it first, but thanks to that person. And I think that that includes everyone who's here. So here in this group, we've had about 400 people participating in this conversation, which is a whole lot of people if I'm being honest. And I think by showing up here, you've shown that you're willing to take some time and learn about how people are trying to make change right here, right now. And I'll read between the lines a bit and assume that you really want to be part of that action. And so, as I mentioned in the beginning and throughout this whole presentation, the Council of Canadians has a lot of different campaigns and projects that we're working on to drive the kind of change that we've been talking about here tonight. One of the projects we have going on that Dylan is my colleague here, helping in the background, thanks Dylan. We've been working on something called Green New Deal Communities, and the idea here is that the power to drive the political will, to make the transformations that we've been talking about here, that power comes from communities organizing together around common goals, and it starts right where we live, right where we are. So we're working with a network of community organizers that includes Hannah and Rebecca and their comrades to directly support community-led campaigns for change under the umbrella of the Green New Deal and Just Recovery. So that support that we're giving to communities, to community groups, looks like a lot of different things, depends on what folks need, but we're doing a lot of support with developing campaign goals and plans, building a base, connecting with other organizers and people where you live, and applying political pressure to decision makers to make change really happen. And then we're also linking those groups of people in different locations together so that we can learn and grow as a network and really kind of unearth the commonalities about what is the Green New Deal that we're asking for in Canada, what are the changes that we want to see first and then second and then third, and so on. And I think by working at that local level, we can also answer that question or explore the question of like, how do we do this in a diverse way that really centers the experience and voices of Indigenous peoples, peoples of color, and other marginalized communities. So I want to invite everyone to join us. I'm going to put a link in the chat as soon as I can move my mouse fast enough to do that. And this link I'm going to send, I'll also send it in the follow-up. It's a quick survey. There's 3 questions. It's who are you, what are you interested in, and how can we help you? So if you fill this out, here it is, there we go. If you want to check out this very short survey, this will link you with Dylan and I, who will be able to follow up in a one-on-one conversation to figure out what it is that you need to go from where you are to broken link, I think. Oh, that's convenient. Okay, I'll look at that. But yeah, I want to invite you into this network that we're building. I want to offer some support, whatever we can give to your communities to figure out how to move from where you are now and how you're organized now to a more powerful place so that we can really take all of that support that Seth demonstrated, that nice graph. Most people support the kinds of changes we're going for, but we're just not quite organized enough to get there yet. And so we're really looking to pull together that organization and that power so we can turn majority support into real action. So I'm going to fix that link. I'm going to find out why it's not working.
Robin, may I offer a final thought while you're
Please do.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks to the Council of Canadians for hosting this, and to Hannah and Rebecca for your involvement, which was so great. I wanted to let people know I'm launching a new initiative which will be public very soon, called the Climate Emergency Unit. It's a 5-year project with the David Suzuki Institute. keep your eyes tuned to how to stay informed about that. Maybe when I have the information, I'll pass it to Robin so she can share it with the people who signed up. That would be great. But it's all about how do we actually animate the ideas in the book and build that political will. In the meantime, there's a lot of urgent things that people can engage in right now, whether it's engaging on C12. The 350.org has a campaign underway around a Just Transition Act. It's federal budget time, and so join me in pushing for this climate emergency just transition transfer. And there's all kinds of Trans Mountain Pipeline opposition stuff, Indigenous-led stuff happening in my province, and solidarity stuff elsewhere in the country. And I just want to share this final thought too, because I know everyone who comes to a thing like this, we all wrestle with despair, and feel deep anxiety about the state of things at the moment. And this question about whether or not we can actually do what we need to do in time. And the truth is, we don't know. We don't know if we're going to do what we need to do in time. That's the ambiguous time in which we live. But consider this, because I'm going to bring it back one last time to the World War II story. I mentioned, as you heard, the population at the time was 11 million people. And over 1 million people from that base enlisted, which is a remarkable figure, isn't it? But you know what? All those people who rallied in the face of fascism 80 years ago, you know what they didn't know? They didn't know if they would win. And they did it anyway. And they surprised themselves by what they were able to accomplish, not only on the battlefront, but in the complete transformation of their economy and social relations at home. And I think that's the spirit we need today.
Well, I think that's a perfect word to end on. So I think that we will say thank you and good night to everyone. Thanks for spending some time with us, and we'll get some more information from us soon. Have a great evening. All right, I'm gonna end it. See you later, everyone. Bye.